And on the first episode, in my notes, I wrote, Jessica sounds so desperate. I didn't write down why I wrote that, but I may go back and try to find it. Hi everyone, my name's Dimitri and welcome back to DimitriTube. Chelsea, Trevor, Jessica, Jimmy, the Love Square. Let's talk about it. As always, if you're enjoying my videos, please go ahead and pound that like button, pound that subscribe button, and ring that notification bell. I'm a growing YouTuber and the likes and subscribes really help me out. In this video, we are gonna talk about Chelsea, Miss Insecurity, and I was gonna make a video just about Chelsea, but when I was scripting it, I was like, I really need to talk about Jessica too, or it's just not gonna make sense. So we're gonna talk about all four of them. Let's dive in. So this is probably gonna be a two-part video. I think it's gonna be too much for a one-part video, but let's just see how it goes. So Chelsea is a 31-year-old flight attendant and she takes an interest in both Trevor and Jimmy. On episode 1, Chelsea says that she was previously married at 18, but ultimately she found out it was not her person. And I want to talk about this. Do you know who else was also a flight attendant and also got married young and also ultimately found out it was just not the right person? Amber from season 4 of Love is Blind, and I thought she was a walking red flag. This is literally the exact same story that Amber had, except the only exception was Amber was married twice, and her excuse was both of the guys just were not her person, and I thought that was a red flag. And let me know how y'all feel about this in the comments. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't think Chelsea is as bad as Amber because she was only married once, but I'm starting to think, oh, they just weren't my person. Like, that's just such a cop-out answer. And I feel like people who give answers like this are just very much idealists about marriage. And if you don't know what an idealist is, it's just someone who envisions an ideal world rather than the real one. Some people consider idealists to be naive and practical and out of touch with reality. And that's how I feel about Chelsea. Chelsea likes the idea of marriage and the idea of being married, but that clouds her judgment when she's trying to choose a partner, which we are going to talk about later in the video. And this is just my opinion, and also from watching so many seasons of this show. To me, divorce is like a big deal, and when people just say, oh, it just wasn't my person, it's starting to come across now as like you're not taking marriage very seriously. In future seasons, when somebody says they were previously divorced and it just wasn't my person, I need the person on the other side of the wall just to start digging deeper and ask more questions like, why didn't you try to make it work? Why didn't you work hard? Like, and again, you don't want to dive into someone's relationship too much, but I don't know. People just need to start digging in more deep. Anyways, let's move on. Next, if you made it this far in the video, please go ahead and pound that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Chelsea takes an interest in Jimmy, a 28-year-old software salesman. He's also a Scorpio and just has a beautiful, deep voice. Like, that man would have up my life too. And Jimmy's not the best looking guy, but that deep voice and that southern accent, like, I could just talk to him all day. So when two women gravitated towards him, I was not surprised at all. Jimmy also takes an interest in Jessica, a 29-year-old executive assistant, absolutely gorgeous, Instagram model ready. And lastly, we have Trevor, a 31-year-old project manager, bodybuilder, and big ol' softie. And that rounds out our love square. Rounds out? Squares out? I know it's a square, but it's not round. Whatever, y'all know what I'm talking about. So let's start off talking about Trevor. Out of this whole love square, he probably has the most insignificant storyline, but we do need to mention him. First thing I want to say about Trevor, either he doesn't know how to dress, or he's a big guy and has just never heard of a tailor before. While in the pods, Trevor looked an absolute mess, and it almost looked like he was unaware that he was going to be on television. Trevor dresses like a bodybuilder who has never had to go anywhere other than the gym. He dresses like all of his clothes came from an outdated big and tall men's shop. And the reason I have a huge problem with this is because within the past 8 years, because of social media, clothing brands now accommodate an even bigger variety of body types. So like 8 years ago, Trevor would have had to either find a tailor or he would just have to wear oversized clothes. But for him to do this in 2023, like, it just doesn't make sense. And there are just so many fitfluencers and bodybuilders on Instagram that have recommendations for clothing brands that fit a more muscular body type like his. I don't know how he missed the memo. And on top of that, like when you're on TV, you want to look your best, or messy YouTubers like me are gonna clown you. And the only smidge of grace that I will give Trevor is that I don't know his stats. I think he's really tall. He may be like 6'4" or 6'5", and he's like a lot of muscle. So yes, when you're that tall, finding clothes is difficult, but it's not impossible. Anyways, Trevor is a big softie. He's like a huge teddy bear, and he loves love movies like The Notebook. And he wants people to see his good heart and kind person before his looks. And when it comes to Trevor in the pods, to me, he seemed like a good person, but he also seemed like he talked a big game, and like just in real life, I just did not see him being that serious. Like there were just so many moments where he just seemed unserious to me. Moving on episode 3 towards the end, Trevor tells Chelsea she's the only one he's interested in and the only one he's dating. But then he also tells her,
but like, I don't ever want to ask you to also narrow it down to one. I want that to be something you choose to do.
So remember that fact. This is very important. We are going to talk about this more later in the video. Now let's talk about Jessica. So Jessica is a 29-year-old executive assistant, and she is also a mother of a 10-year-old. And on the first episode, in my notes, I wrote, Jessica sounds so desperate. I didn't write down why I wrote that, but I may go back and try to find it. And Jessica is absolutely drop dead gorgeous, and she's Instagram model ready. But her main storyline when she takes an interest in Jimmy is that she has a daughter, and she isn't quite sure when to mention to him that she has a daughter. So Jessica does not mention her daughter at first, but she eventually tells Jimmy about it. And the thing about Netflix and being in the pods is we have no idea of timelines in these pods. Like, she didn't say it on the first date, but also we don't know how much time has passed from their first date to when she actually mentioned having a daughter. But when she mentions it, Jimmy responds back and says, why didn't you mention it earlier? And he says it in a way for us as an audience to assume that she probably should have mentioned it sooner. And just a heads up, this is my opinion. Netflix editing really could have went one or two ways in this. Jessica got a very generous edit, in my opinion. She could have been painted as a villain trying to hide something when in these pods and dating. But Netflix didn't go that route. They gave her a very good edit, and they very much made the reasoning for her doing this was wanting to protect her daughter. But if you think about it, Netflix really did not have to go that route, and they could have tried to make her look like a deadbeat mom. So it's clear there was a specific story that they were trying to tell. Because in the grand scheme of things, you're supposed to date in these pods, and then after you get out of these pods, you have 4 weeks to get married. If you have a daughter, that is something you need to mention as soon as possible. And even if you're in the real world, having a kid is also something you need to mention very soon. So I truly think Netflix threw her a bone with this edit. They really threw her a bone. Next, dating with children is such a weird thing to navigate. Like, I don't have any kids, so I can't relate, but I'm gonna try to relate as best as possible. At one point in the pods, Jessica tells Jimmy, and she's talking about her daughter, she's the most important part of my life. And that makes dating so weird, because a lot of guys and a lot of women want to be number one when dating someone. But if you're dating someone with a kid, you kind of gotta fall to the background a little bit and realize that their child is number one and more important. And that's just like so weird to navigate. So if a man or a woman is dating and they specifically say they do not want to date someone who already has kids, like, I get it, and I don't think it's wrong to do that. That's just my opinion. But you do have to realize that the older you get, and if you date people who are older, the chances of them having kids are greater. So if you say you do not want someone with kids, you limit your options. Next, Jessica explains to Jimmy her baby daddy situation, and her explanation to me was a red flag. And we get the details of the situation at different points in the pods, but I'm gonna explain it as best as I can. So when she first explains it, she says her baby father is someone she grew up with and knew for a long time. She was not and they broke up 1 year after her daughter was born, and they were never married. And she also had her daughter at 18 years old. And at no point does Jessica hint that her getting pregnant may have been an accident or may have not been her best judgment or anything like that. She takes the route of saying her kid is an absolute blessing and the best thing that has ever happened to her in her life. And then later on, Jessica talks about her parents, and she says that both of her biological parents suffered from addiction, and she ended up having to go to foster care. She was in foster care for a while before she got adopted. She got adopted at 16, and then she later on got pregnant at 17. And she even says when she got pregnant, had she not been adopted, her daughter would have been fostered as well, because she wouldn't have been able to have custody as a 17-year-old. And this is interesting because, yes, I understand part of it is just a cycle. Like, if your parents had you young, it's likely that you will have children young as well. And it's tough to be the one that breaks the cycle. Like, I totally get that. Sorry, y'all. I forgot to say this when I was filming, but for Jessica to be in foster care and then get pregnant and potentially have her kid go to foster care is pretty crazy. But it is also weird to me that Jessica mentions that she has a daughter at 18. And yes, legally you can have a child at that age, but at the same time, most 18-year-olds are not financially sound enough to have a child. So when she first mentioned that, I thought she came from money and her parents were, I don't want to say cool with it, but they were down to like help her out. And not only that, for Jessica to say that due to the age at which she had her child almost went to foster care. So for her to say that, but not mention that maybe that was not the best time to have her child was pretty wild to me. If I was Jimmy, I would have asked her, did you feel prepared at that point in life to have a child? And then I would have asked a few more questions from there. And it's very much possible Jimmy did ask more questions. We just didn't see it. Anyways, moving on. So while they're in the pods, Jessica and Jimmy connect really well, and Jessica gets really emotional and she ends up writing him a note. And this was very much a turning point in their relationship because Jessica really wants him, but Jimmy is still undecided between her and Chelsea. And Jimmy explains he needs to think deeply due to the fact that she has Autumn, her daughter. And I do want to unpack this. So early on when Jimmy and Jessica were dating, Jessica does mention that she has a daughter, and she asks if Jimmy is cool with it. And Jimmy responds, yeah, it's okay that you have a kid. It's fine, yada, yada, yada. So like I said earlier in the video, if you're a man or a woman and you would prefer to not date someone with kids, I don't think there is a problem with that. But in this moment, if Jimmy had said he has no interest in dating someone with a kid, he would have gotten dragged on social media. This is just my opinion. When it comes to these dating shows, guys can often be critiqued a lot harder than the women. And I do think if a guy were to go on the show and explicitly say, yeah, I have no interest in dating someone with kids, I think a lot of people on social media would have a problem with it. Next thing I want to say about this, the purpose of dating is to get married, but the other purpose is to also learn what you do and what you do not want in a partner. And in the grand scheme of things, Jimmy was 28 at the time of filming, so he was still kind of young, and he said he was okay with dating someone who has a child, but after he took some time to think about it, I think he realized that that is not something he wanted. And that's just part of dating. Like, yes, he told Jessica her having a kid doesn't matter, but I think he went back to the pods and ultimately thought about, oh, am I ready to be a stepdad? Like, oh, am I ready to be a father of someone else's child? And I think he realized that's not something that he wanted. And I do think that is part of the reason he ultimately chooses Chelsea. After that, Jessica does not take Jimmy's response very well, but she puts pressure on the relationship and she asks Jimmy for answers and she pressures Jimmy to make a decision. And the one read I will have for Jessica on this is that I am glad she put pressure on the relationship, because in these situations you just have to do that. But also at the same time, earlier in the pods she said she would be patient and wait for Jimmy to make a decision, but I guess her patience has run thin. And I want to talk about this a little bit more because this was really interesting, because this season we had two approaches. Trevor and Jessica both only had one option and they were waiting on their option to make a decision. Trevor was patient and told Chelsea, take as much time as you need, whereas Jessica put pressure on the relationship and pressured Jimmy to make a decision. And I think Jessica's route is the better route, and that's the route Trevor should have taken. And I'm gonna talk about that more a little later in the video. And sidebar, this season of Love is Blind, the studio must have been freezing because all of the contestants were constantly wrapped in blankets. Moving back to Chelsea and Jimmy, so at the end of episode 3, Chelsea and Jimmy have a major emotional moment, but also Chelsea in general is just very emotional, possibly too emotional. And later on, Chelsea has a one-on-one with Trevor in the pods, and Chelsea talks about how she's insecure about her looks, and Trevor reassures her and says, I love you, and that looks don't matter. He likes her as a person. And at this point, it becomes very clear that Chelsea and Jimmy have a deeper and much more emotional connection than she has with Trevor. And then one of the funniest parts, Chelsea goes back to the women's side of the house and she says,
Trevor just told me he loved me, and I'm so used to guys being mean to me, like.
And Chelsea is ultimately worried about hurting someone and making the wrong decision. But like we've seen on this show many a times, you kind of just have to make a decision and stick with it and go with your gut. And not only that, when they were in the pods, it honestly seemed like Chelsea would be satisfied with either guy she chose. And one more read that I do have on Chelsea is that when she was dating Trevor in the pods, she buys him a bracelet that says, my heart will always be with you, or something like that. And she was still dating Jimmy at that point, and I'm like, why would you buy someone that if you're still not deciding on who you're gonna pick? Like, I thought that was kind of messy. But after that, we ultimately get to the root of our love square, and Chelsea is trying to choose between Jimmy and Trevor, and Jimmy is trying to choose between Chelsea and Jessica. And remember how I said earlier in the video, Trevor put no pressure on it, but Jessica put pressure on it? This is what I want to talk about. We are on season 6 now, and there is definitely some psychology behind this experiment, and this is just my opinion. On this show, when a woman is in a love triangle and they have the upper hand, they are very shady about how they handle it. We saw this with Micah, we saw this with Jackie, and we also saw this from Mallory in season 2. Whereas when the guys are in love triangles and they have the upper hand, they're just usually not as shady in terms of how they handle it. And if you want to disagree with that, just put it in the comments. But frequently when women are in love triangles on this show and they have the upper hand, they are very shady about the way they handle it. I'm sorry, y'all just don't have a good track record on this show. And at the end of episode 3, I think, Chelsea was absolutely gagged when Trevor asked her to marry him. At this point, she had 2 guys vying for her heart, and it was clear she had never been in a situation like that before. And we know this because Chelsea herself even said,
Trevor just told me he loved me, and I'm so used to guys being mean to me, like.
So Jimmy, who is also in a love triangle and trying to make a decision, decides to consult Chelsea and talk to her about it. And that was just a really dumb move, I think. Throughout this process, Jimmy makes multiple mistakes, like, don't we all? We're all human, but this is just another one of them. Jimmy should have consulted his bros when trying to make this decision. He shouldn't have talked to Chelsea about the girl she's competing against. Like, I just don't think that was strategic. And clearly don't talk to Trevor, but at this point, there were other guys in the house he could have talked to. And the problem with Jimmy is he takes a long time to make a decision, and not necessarily like that's a problem, but when you're in this situation, you just have to go with your gut and make a decision, because no matter what, you're not going to be like 1,000%. But for some reason, a lot of these contestants want to be 1,000%, but just given the short amount of time, you're never going to be 1,000%. So Jimmy ends up telling Chelsea, I love you, and he ultimately ends up choosing her. And clock me in the comments if this is wrong, but I'm pretty sure Trevor said I love you first, but then Jimmy proposed to Chelsea first. If that's not right, just clock me in the comments, but I think I'm right. And this is just my opinion. I think Jimmy ultimately chose Chelsea over Jessica for 2 reasons. Like, at some point, Jimmy realized he either doesn't want to be a dad or he's just not ready to be a dad. Take your pick, but I do think that did play a factor. here. And then the second reason, I truly think Jessica just challenged him in a way that like I just don't think he likes. And overall, Chelsea is just more agreeable. And like, it's nothing personal. Some guys just like that. And I truly think Jessica would have just been a little too feisty for him. And like, and if Jimmy did choose Jessica, I do think they would have had fun for a little bit, but do I think they would have lasted? Probably not. And then after that, Chelsea tells a few of the women, or tells all the women on the women's side of the house, that Jimmy said, "I love you." And this is overheard by Laura. And this, hands down, to me was like the messiest part of the season. And y'all, Laura really should have gotten more smoke for her behavior this season, but for some reason she didn't. Like, I truly think she should have been dragged much harder at the reunion than she was, but that's not what happened. So Laura ends up going to Jessica and telling her that Jimmy told Chelsea, "I love you," and she's about to not be picked. And this was just so messy. Laura should not have done this. And I totally get it. I'm pretty sure Laura did this because if she was in the same situation, she would want one of the girls in the house to tell her before it happens. But she robbed Jimmy of the opportunity to break up with Jessica himself. Like, she almost kind of like robbed him of that nobility. And not only that, when Jimmy broke up with Jessica himself, it was no less painful. Like, if anything, it stung more the second time, Jessica hearing it from Jimmy, because there was still that chance that Laura could have been wrong. And Jessica was very upset, but she also argues that it was dumb for Jimmy to make a decision while they were in the middle of an argument. And I understand her point, but at the end of the day, I still think it would have been the same outcome. Like, yes, I agree with you. Jimmy probably should not have made his decision when he was arguing with you, but also I think even if y'all weren't arguing, I still think he would have chose Chelsea. Ultimately, what's meant to be will happen. And during the breakup, I felt so bad for Jessica, but also at the same time, Mama was giving us a show and she understood the assignment. When she walked into that pod with Jimmy, she was pissed. She knew what was coming and she was out for blood. And this is all because of Laura. Also, sidebar, if it was me, I would have rather have had Jimmy just break up with me, because then I could have just cried by myself in the pod. But since Laura blabbed it on the women's side of the house, she had to cry on the women's side of the house in front of everyone. Like, I would have rather had Jimmy do it so I could just cry by myself. Anyways, Mama gave us a show. Hair was laid, dress was bussin', shoes was bussin', makeup was bussin'. Like, she understood the assignment. Like, she gave us a show. And I was completely gagged during this breakup.
When you see me and you realize what you missed out on, you are gonna choke.
Y'all, that was literally the gag. Sometimes in the morning when I'm brushing my teeth, I recite those exact lines. And sorry, y'all, I forgot to mention this when I was filming, but when Jessica went off on Jimmy and said, "When you see me, you're gonna choke," clearly she missed the point of the experiment. The point of the experiment was to choose someone not based on looks, but based on personality. So when she doesn't get picked, she rubs in his face how bad of a bitch she is. And I get it, this is reality TV and she needed her moment, but also she clearly missed the point of the experiment. And then to go even a step further, it probably stung even more knowing that Jimmy decided not to choose her because of her personality. Like, it had absolutely nothing to do with looks. So that probably stung even more. Anyways, so they break up. Jessica blames him and says he should be ashamed. And she also says he ruined her opportunity in the show. And that's not true. So I get it, Jessica's upset and she's in the moment, but it was her choice to date Jimmy and then throw out all of her other options. That was her choice. And her experience wasn't ruined, it just didn't work out. For the majority of the people who go to the pods, most of them don't find love. So the experience wasn't ruined. Like, yes, she got in deeper, but it wasn't ruined. And I think that's enough for now with this video. We'll talk about Chelsea's breakup and all of Chelsea and Jimmy's arguments in the next video. I think that's a good halfway point. Thank you so much. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and pound that like button, pound that subscribe button, and ring that notification bell, and I will see you next time with the part 2. Have a good one. Bye.